Good afternoon and welcome to today's third session on prosperity. I'm Silvia Sciarelli Borrelli, the Financial Times Milan correspondent. So prosperity, it's a multifaceted topic that entails economic growth, but also takes into account other variables such as social inclusion and well-being. And now, more than ever, 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had so many repercussions on people's livelihoods, this is a timely and very important proposition. Italy's G20 will focus on prosperity as a prerequisite to ensure a long-term, fair and sustainable economic recovery. Investment in digitalization and infrastructure, as well as free trade and recovery measures might be key enablers to achieve this goal. However, mounting public and private debt worldwide, especially in emerging countries, is a burden that risks prompting a new global financial crisis. During this session, keynote speakers and our panelists will discuss how to support a fair and sustainable recovery while also avoiding another global financial crisis. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to share with our audience two pre-recorded video contributions by European Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni and Tetsushi Sonobe, the Chief Executive Officer of the Asian Development Bank. They have been asked to address what their own priority on prosperity is for the G20 this year, and they explain it in the video that is launching now. Please.
Dear friends, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you at the Inception Conference of Think20. We stand at the beginning of the new era for multilateralism because of the changing of the guard in Washington, and also because the challenges we face today demand a common response: defeating the pandemic, tackling the climate change, relaunching our economies, reversing the rise in inequalities. And I know that Italy is totally committed to rising those challenges through this G20 presidency. Let me focus on the third of the three Ps that Italy will define the work of the G20 this year: prosperity. Just as it did during the financial crisis, the G20 has a key role to play in getting the global economy back on its feet and in moving to a new, more inclusive growth in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. That means implementing the G20 action plan in response to the crisis, avoiding any premature withdrawal of economic policy support. Just as we are doing in the European Union, the G20 economies must keep working together to respond to the evolving health and economic situation, while focusing on the green and digital transitions. It also means cooperating closely with the OECD to conclude an agreement on the international tax architecture, addressing the challenges raised by digitalization. The Commission will support the Italian Presidency in this endeavor. Showing solidarity means not only implementing the debt service suspension initiative and the new common framework on debt treatment for low-income countries. It also means strengthening the response capacity of IMF and committing our countries now to a global effort for vaccination. Because prosperity must be shared among all the people on this planet. So I wish Italy every success with its G20 presidency, and I look forward to being inspired by the work of the Think20 at this Inception Conference and throughout the coming year. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I offer my hearty congratulations on the good start of T20 Italy and thank the organizers for the opportunity to share my thoughts during this virtual Inception Conference. We have 6 priority areas. The first is green and resilient recovery from COVID-19, including the promotion of circular economy and renewable energy. The second is poverty eradication and greater equality, including safety nets, casting safety nets to reach vulnerable groups, and facilitating quality job creation, and increasing the employability of people in the developing world. The third area is making cities more livable, including improvements in water and sanitation services. The fourth area is healthy aging, that is maintaining health in old age. The fifth area is digital divide and international tax cooperation in the digital economy. The sixth area is competition policy, which exists but is neglected in many emerging and developing economies. In these 6 priority areas, ADB Institute creates and disseminates timely evidence-based knowledge that supports policy design and implementation. Timely and evidence-based may not sound very compatible with each other because it may take us a long time to obtain evidence about the true impact of public policy. But there is a range of the quality of evidence, from scientific evidence to statistical, historical, anecdotal, and circumstantial evidence. We are determined to provide stronger evidence than others in a timely manner. For this purpose, we are transforming our activities digitally. For example, combining surveys, randomized controlled trials, and big data by using artificial intelligence. And we are expanding and deepening our collaboration with external brains. We look forward to working with you to guide policymakers better. This is a priority of our priorities. I conclude by congratulating the success of this virtual Inception Conference and pledging ADB Institute's support to T20 Italy. Thank you for your attention.
Fascinating perspectives from our keynote speakers and definitely ambitious and challenging priorities. Now on to our panel discussion. Let me start by introducing all of our speakers. We have a parterre du roi this afternoon. I'll start with Gao Haiyong, professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Emma Marcegaglia, chair of the B20 Italy. Pier Carlo Padoan, the incoming chairman of Unicredit. He's also Italy's former finance minister and the lead co-chair of the Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth at the T20. And Dennis Snower, president of Germany's Global Solutions Initiative. I'll go around our virtual table twice. If I could ask our speakers to be conscious of time, we'll aim to save the last 10 minutes take questions from the audience. And in this respect, for those of you watching online, you can submit questions to our speakers through the T20 website. The team will forward them to me and I'll pass them on to the speakers at the end of the session. So the first question is for Professor Gao. Good afternoon and thank you for being with us. So China has been less impacted by the crisis than other G20 countries, at least thus far. And it's increasing its economic standing worldwide. But with great honor also comes great responsibility. So how should we read China's multilateral efforts in the economic and financial fields?
Hello, hello from Beijing. Thank you very much for having me in this panel. China is the first country to face the outbreak, and a quick containment allowed the economy to recover faster than many others. So as the second largest economy, I think China's recovery actually has positive spillover through trade and many other channels to the world. So this is the immediate contribution that China could make to the solid recovery globally. And secondly, regarding the multilateral efforts, so actually China has been a beneficiary of multilateral system in the past. And there is no reason for China not to be willing to take responsibilities. In fact, in the past, right after the global financial crisis, China joined the efforts to reform the international multilateral institutions like the quota reform, SDR reform in the MF. China also initiated new institutions like AIIB. Those efforts actually, helped close supply gaps in public goods, which is very constructive. And now, because it's a pandemic, no country alone can deal with the crisis. There are short-term shocks and as well as long-term challenges. So what we need to do is to work on common challenges and share mutual responsibilities. And I think China is ready to do more on this. The third point I would like to say is that as long as China's role is concerned, the country's openness matters, because this is a way to keep China to continuously interact with the outside world. It is also, an opportunity for other countries to take advantage of China's big market. And more importantly, in the past, we experienced the openness and the reform always go hand in hand. So we expect more domestic reforms, which I believe could consolidate, the foundations for China to join multilateral efforts. This is my answers to the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. Mrs. Marcegaglia, this year will be crucial to restart the engine of economic growth in most countries. And in this sense, dialogue and coordination between governments, businesses, and stakeholders is absolutely pivotal. As chair of the B20, could you share with us the B20's priorities?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to the Think 20. And also let me thank Professor Magri, because we are already trying to working together to coordinate also among our enforcement group, because we want really to make to have the G20 Italy as a real success, and so we will work together. Well, of course, the B20, as you know, represent the business. We will have around 1,000 delegates, 3,000 participants, including top executives from the leading multinational corporation. And we will represent a community of 6.5 million business in the G20 countries. So we're talking about the engine of the world economic development. We have witnessed an enormous interest to participate to our B20, because we know why. Because the B20, 2021 must be and will be a kind of the year of renaissance. It must be remembered as the year when the virus was defeated, and as you said, should be also the year of the return to growth. But how we will emerge from the crisis and what awaits us is not so clear. So we try to say how we see the situation, and this is embedded in our claim of the B20, which is reshape the future, include, share, and act. The first thing I want to say, and it has been already said from the previous speaker, is that if we have to take a lesson from the pandemic, is that we can face and try to solve all the different global issues, that we have to say clearly we're already there also before the pandemic. So if there is a way to try to solve this problem, is to work together, to coordinate together. Think about the vaccination in 9 months instead of 10 years. So we agree on the fact that we have to go back to a strong and sound multilateralism. We will work strongly on that. We will also work on the reform of the World Trade Organization that is needed, because we know that Trump has really created a lot of problems to WTO, to other multilateral institutions, but we have also to say that they start not to work in a proper way since 2014, 2015. So the first point is we have to go back to multilateralism, and the Biden administration, I think, will be a strong push on that. And also we'll try to make a strong reform on the WTO, which is very important if we want to enhance trade, and if we want to help a small, medium enterprise to be part of the global value chain. Second point is about inclusion. So we know that we want to go back to growth through, a model which is based on free and fair markets, on the innovation of companies to boost employment. But it's also very clear to us that we have to take as companies a strong responsibility in really to reach a high level of social inclusion and environmental sustainability. So for us, this means that we want to work strongly on achieving a carbon neutrality, working on, for example, a carbon pricing all over the world. This is key. And I think the innovation, the technology of business is key if we want to get there, if we want really to go beyond words and really have a strong carbon neutrality. We want to work a lot on employability. It has been said also before. So employment is very important. All over the world, we have problems of people without jobs. And I think the most hit people are women and youth. So employment is very important. We will work strongly on that. We will work strongly on digital as an enabler, as a boost for growth, but also because we need a level playing field in terms of tax, in terms of regulation, also on digital. We will work a lot on infrastructure, on finance, to have good access to finance to the SMEs. And then we have two final, let's say, task forces that will work on two very important points, which are a new thing in the B20. The first one is health, life, and science. This is very important. Of course, we are in the era of the pandemic. So, of course, we want to understand how to give access to all the people all over the world to good health. We want to strongly work on innovation, in working together as it has been done with the vaccination all over the world. And the second task force that we introduce, we call it global emergencies. We want to be prepared and also give a good, and business has to work on that, to also be able to face the next emergencies. We hope, everybody hope that we will not have another pandemic, but this can happen. One of the next emergencies could be a strong cybersecurity attack. So the other thing we want to work on is to have a strong coordination between public and private to face possible next emergencies that the world will face. So thank you very much. We will work strongly, and we really want to have a very strong collaboration with the Team 20, and we hope to do a very good job together.
Thank you, Ms. Marcegaglia. I'd like to bring in Professor Padoan at this point. Ms. Marcegaglia spoke about a new renaissance, but also outlined the lack of clarity that faces us in terms of recovery. And many people have raised warnings on the consequences of the economic recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and the risks that this entails to the global financial system. The G20 has a primary responsibility for ensuring financial stability at a global level. So what do you think it can do to prevent a new financial crisis, and what type of cooperation, coordination should the G20 leaders pursue in the post-COVID economic environment?
Well, thank you, and good afternoon and good evening to our guests. Well, indeed, the point you started from is exactly where I thought I should start from. Almost 15 years ago, the great financial crisis broke out, And the G20, which was until then a meeting of finance ministers, was elevated to leaders level to highlight the fact that in front of a global crisis, we need a global response and global policy action. After that, the G20 established the working group on strong, sustainable, and balanced growth, which eventually also became inclusive growth, just to say that the agenda shifted under the pressure of events. Now we're facing a new crisis, which is by many people view much deeper and devastating than the great financial crisis. And indeed, the G20 is called again to exercise a role of coordination and in drive to respond to the crisis. Now, let me use my time very briefly to highlight what I think are the challenges and the threats to a strong and extended recovery for the crisis. Well, first of all, many have highlighted that we will not go back to previous growth models. We need to work towards the establishment of a new growth model, which has sustainability and social compatibility at its hard core. And this is exactly what is needed, which means from an economic point of view that the world economy has to undergo a major reallocation of resources towards more sustainable uses, towards more sustainable capital allocation, towards more sustainable jobs distribution and wealth production, or well-being, to take on board the expression that Jeff Sachs introduced in the previous panel. So the first challenge for the G20 is to establish a mechanism that facilitates reallocation of capital throughout the world, both through private investment and through public investment. However, before we get there, we have to deal with some challenging macroeconomic obstacles. The first challenge is the short term. In the short term, the priority of public policy has been to fill the holes that have been generated by the pandemic eruption. The big recession that is common to all advanced and fortunately not so much emerging economies has to be faced. Otherwise, the loss of wealth, the loss of jobs would become unsustainable. So the first target has been to pour public money to face the crisis. This has been the right response. Now, the right response needs to be complemented by the appropriate exit from that emergency situation, and therefore to the need to reallocate resources towards the long term. This is where I see two other major risks. One is that there is a risk of divergence. Some areas of the world may go faster than others. For instance, there is already a debate going on among economists and policymakers of the fact that the US economy, especially with the new administration, may take off much more rapidly with respect to, say, the European economy, while at the same time, Asian economies like China are doing much better. So there is a risk of divergence in the global economy, which needs to be avoided, because divergence never brings more growth, brings more conflict. And second point, there is an issue of sustainability, which you yourself mentioned. How much debt is sustainable? Well, this is where you allow me to quote the Chairman Draghi's recent idea, which is extremely important, distinguishing between good debt and bad debt. Good debt is something that is highlighted, as it's considered to finance investment and sustainable growth. Bad debt is related to public debt being augmented because of the increased resort to subsidies to fill the hole, to fill the gaps of the recession. So the other challenge that the G20 exert is to find a way to respond both to the short term and to the long term. And finally, this has to be done in a collaborative fashion. Emma Marcegaglia, among others, already highlighted this point. Economic cooperation is key to guarantee success of a policy response, which must leverage all the policy tools we have: fiscal, monetary, structural, and last but not least, trade. Let me finish with this note on trade. In the previous financial crisis, there was a lot of fear among observers and policymakers that the global economy could go through a protectionist wave, which did not happen, fortunately. Now we are not facing that risk, but we are facing the risk of fragmentation. And the pandemic may highlight the risk of fragmentation and healthcare protectionism, which would be a disaster. So there is a strong agenda awaiting out there for the G20, but this time the G20 cannot fail. It is the institutional response to the big COVID crisis. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Padoan. Lots of things on the plate just there. Professor Snower, we just heard from Professor Padoan, who called for a reallocation of resources and capital around the world. And he also recalled the major policy response that has been demanded to governments and institutions around the world and the distinction between good and bad debt. Now, I wonder, we normally consider GDP, gross domestic product, as a key indicator to measure a country's economic performance. But given today's increasing complexity, would it be wise to take into account other factors to assess prosperity and welfare? And what role can the G20 and the T20 play to shed more light on these other important factors that we should take into account in this respect?
I'm very pleased you asked this excellent question, because I believe we have no other choice than to take into account, as we've heard from Professor Padoan and others, environmental sustainability and social inclusion and thriving societies generally. And the way forward is to measure these things, to measure them consistently across countries, across time, and across stakeholders, so that policymakers, business, civil organizations all face the same metric. We have such a metric with regard to economic performance. That's GDP and its distribution. We need metrics concerning the social and the environmental side. On the environmental side, we have made lots of progress. We have an environmental performance index, which is very wide. We measure carbon emissions, making lots of progress there, and hopefully we will gain the necessary coherence. Where we are still trailing behind is in the measurement of social inclusion, social cohesion. And there we are in the Global Solutions Initiative, spearheading an initiative to measure two things. One is social solidarity, which is inward solidarity, is how well embedded are you in your society. The other is outward solidarity. Well, how willing are you to build bridges to those who are not part of your social group? And that can be measured. There are lots of surveys that can be measured with the same regularity as GDP. There are surveys, for example, on giving behavior, helping a stranger, donating money, the degree to which you trust other people, the social support you have in your network of family and friends. So one can measure both inward and outward solidarity. Then, in addition, we have agency. That is, how empowered do people feel in terms of shaping their destiny through their own efforts? And that too can be measured in terms of labor market insecurity, how many people face vulnerable employment, what their life expectancy is, years in education, etc. And we have now constructed such measures, and the next step will be to build bridges between these measures and the SDGs, the Better Life Index, and so on, in order to enable reporting to take place on both government and business front. And that brings me to the second topic, which also Professor Padoan directed attention to, which is we will not go back to the previous status quo after this pandemic, because if we did, we would face disaster, given the way the world is going, both in terms of climate change and in the degree of social fragmentation, inequality, political fragmentation we face now. Therefore, we need to make sure that our policies, fiscal policy, structural policies, instead of ossifying the economy, keeping people in jobs that may no longer exist, helping businesses as long as they struggle, instead helping people and businesses adapt. And we have lots of experience in how that's done in the labor market, because in the 1990s, we moved from passive labor market policies to active labor market policies, which are policies to give people incentives to become employed and to get skilled. And now we need to do the same, not only labor markets, but also in product markets and capital markets. So governments need to move from their current policy of simply supporting people who are in trouble to actively helping them help themselves in this new world that we are approaching. Change jobs where necessary, become more adaptable. That requires a significant amount of education and training. And we know how to give this, both to individuals and to firms. And furthermore, governments can play an important role in matching. What we do not have is another Great Depression on our hands. What we have is a great mismatch, that there are some sectors that are booming, whereas others have collapsed. And what we need to do is match the excess capital that is released in the declining sectors with the capital that is required in the rising sectors. And similarly for labor. And so these adaptation policies are the policies to which we will need to move in the future. And my last point is that we urgently need to reform digital governance. At present, the digital service providers are the ones who own all the data about people, and that is profoundly disempowering. And they are the ones who form social networks for us. What we need is to come to a new equilibrium in which users gain control, both individual and collective control, over the data that is about them. And that can be done very easily by ensuring that official data, like data about your name, date of birth, property, and so on, can only be taken from authentic official sources. That the private data that you generate yourself is in your control. You have access and control over it. And those second-party private data, that is data generated by other people about you, can only be used in the interests of the data subject. And then data that is meant to be shared, like data that's necessary to control, track and trace in a pandemic, can only be used for the purposes that this data commons specifies. And that is the new world into which we need to go. In the Global Solutions Initiative, we've again proposed a set of policies that will take us there. And I believe that in the combination of adaptation policy in terms of fiscal and structural policies and new forms of digital governance that empowers users, we will be well on our way, provided that we also take seriously the measurement of social cohesion, environmental sustainability alongside economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Snower. I hope you are right and we are well on our way, although sometimes it feels like we are still quite far off when it comes to digital and data. But hopefully you're right and we are getting there. I'd like to go around our virtual table once again before I open up to questions from the audience. Back to Professor Gao. We've heard from our panelists the importance and the risk and the burden of public debt in many countries. So I'd like to ask you, as one of the biggest creditors of emerging countries, what can China do to alleviate the burden on these countries?
Right. So this is a very important issue. China has recently become a major creditor of developing and least developed countries. As China's credit actually largely goes to infrastructure, I think the real challenge comes from the questions of how to make that sustainable and more transparent. So here are a few points coming to my mind. First, the traditional creditors, including the IMF, World Bank, Paris Club, and many other developed countries, have established good practice, standards, and mechanism in debt restructuring and relief. And there are very good examples of valuable experience. And China actually is a newcomer, and China can learn and catch up. So this is the first point. Second, China's loans are in various forms, and the borrowing countries actually are in different positions, conditions. So this is a challenge, and I think this is also an opportunity in a way that it is necessary to open for new ideas, like to consider some green or sustainable solutions together to solve the problem. And the third, China is a large creditor, as you said, but China is not the only creditor. So I think for a large scale of debt elevation, it's China's interest to join collective actions and to coordinate with multilateral institutions and other lenders. The G20, the DSII actually is a very good start. And as promised, China actually suspend quite a number of payments to the participating bilateral lenders under this framework. So I think under T20 Italian Presidency this year, this effort will be continued, and which I hope to end up with more concrete and feasible solutions. This is my answer.
Okay, thank you. I think the call you made on multilateralism and collaboration is very, very important. Back to Mrs. Marcegaglia, a question on SMEs. These are the backbones of most of the G20 economies, surely of the Italian economy, but they're also highly exposed and sometimes more vulnerable than bigger companies. What can the G20 do to support them and make sure they are in the best conditions to thrive?
Yes, thank you. As you said, small medium enterprise have a critical roles in the G20 economies. For example, they employ between 40 and 90% of the labor force among the different G20 countries, accounting for up to 90% of total firms, generating from 35 to 60 of the GDP. But as you said, they are by default the more vulnerable part to shocks and disproportionately affected by the lack of resource and skills, including those necessary to adapt to technological changes to waiving regulatory frameworks. So, as it has been said from all the different speakers, all the challenges that we have in front of us, I mean, for the small medium enterprise, they're still more important and even more difficult. So, I think several statistics demonstrate how the sharp fall in economic activity caused by COVID-19 has affected SMEs compared with the large business. Two main reasons behind. The first, they are highly involved in some of the most affected sectors. Think about tourism, services, and they also suffer of chronic shortage of liquidity. They are highly exposed also to cost of adjusting business models and working practice. What Professor Snower has said before, it's very important for all the different companies adapting, changing, also helping the flow of labor from one part to the other, but it's very important, even more difficult for small, medium enterprise. So the OECD estimated that around 50% of the micro, small, and medium enterprise might not survive the coming months of suspending production and reduce consumer demand. So insolvencies of small, medium enterprise worldwide would have serious consequences, not only for employment and economic stability, but also for large businesses that depend on their supplier. So it's very important what G20 can do. I think the first important thing is for what regards the first time frame government's measure to introduce so far should remain in place until the recovery is firmly established. This is very important. We cannot just say, okay, we stop now because the recovery, the economy is doing a little bit better. I refer in particular to new lending under concessional terms, delayed repayment and taxes, credit guarantees, debt moratorium, or wage subsidies. The second, as we said, we need to help small, medium enterprise with active policy on labor, in helping them to adapt to the new paradigm. And the third part, which is very important, is that we need, the G20 need to help the small, medium enterprise all over the G20 countries to integrate into the global economy and in the global value chains. As Professor Padon has said, what we have experienced with the pandemic is not the death of globalization, is not the rise of protectionism, but on the contrary, it is very clear that the companies who are integrated in global value chains have reacted better than other companies. So I think we really need to help small, medium enterprise to be more internationalized. And in this part, what I've said before about the WTO reform is key. So the WTO reform is not important for the multinational. Yes, it is also important for the big company, but it's even more important for the small companies because we need to help them with lower trade cost, enhancing trade facilitation and connectivity, reduce barriers to trade in goods and services, but also facilitate access to small and medium enterprise to trade finance and to insurance products. So we have to work a lot on that. The G20 has to work a lot on that. And of course, we have the forthcoming WTO Ministerial Conference that will take place later this year. And this is a first moment where we can talk about that. So it's very important that we protect our company, not protect, we help the small, medium enterprise to be a part of the global value chain, to adapt and to be ready to take the opportunities also that will come also from this new world that will not be, as it has been said, similar or the same that we have seen before the pandemic.
Thank you, Mrs. Marcegaglia. I think that's an important message. I think businesses don't necessarily want to be protected, but they want to be sustained, and they want conditions in order to thrive and be viable. And in this context, I'd like to bring back Professor Padoan. The prospect of of a pandemic recovery has proved more elusive than expected. We heard from Ms. Marcegaglia the risks of insolvency in the SME world. And it's not just a problem for the SME world, but governments are now pinning their hopes on recovery plans aimed at ensuring sustainable growth. So in your view, what should be the focus of the discussion among the G20 leaders, and what is the most effective strategy or strategies for an economic recovery in the current context?
Because it is related to something I already mentioned in my previous intervention. It is the challenge of linking the short term to the long term. In the short term, many governments have poured huge amounts of money building up debt with the sole purpose of facing the challenge of resisting the big recession dynamics in all countries. This was unavoidable, and maybe we need much more of that. There is an intriguing debate going on in the economic profession nowadays between those who think that the fiscal stimulus engineered by the new US administration is too much because it will bring up inflation, while others, as respected as well, very respected economists, are arguing the contrary, that it's not enough. Many argue that in Europe, the fiscal stimulus engineered by the European authorities is not enough. So there is an issue of, at the same time, dealing with the short term, the emergency, avoiding that too many people get unemployed for too long time, that too many companies go bankrupt, because that will disrupt the productive base. But at the same time, we need to move towards some form of more sustainable growth in the medium term. So the big question is, for how long do we need to keep those emergency measures, which in the meantime build up debt, and where can we move towards the medium term? Here again, there is a problem, which I highlighted in my previous comments, and Professor Snow also raised, which is the great misallocation. Now, the point is that we need to shift capital from one place to the other, one geography to the other, one sector to the other, one company to the other. How do we do this? We're not in planned economies. I don't think we should go into planned economies. We need allocation mechanisms. So we need to ask ourselves, how can governments help reallocation towards more sustainable growth? How can the financial system, which is by definition the greatest allocation mechanism we have in markets, help? And so this is a new challenge. How can the G20 help to do this? To bring together governments and also the private sector to discuss together what kind of instruments can be put on the table to improve the allocation system. We are facing the paradox, and I'll stop on that many companies are building up their bank deposits because they don't know what to do with the money in presence of high uncertainty, while other companies don't have enough money and liquidity to deal on a day-by-day basis. So there is a big misallocation problem that is a challenge for policymakers.
Thank you, Professor Paduan. And now back to Professor Snower. This question might also relate to your previous comments, but I think it's very important to go in depth. So how do you think the G20 can contribute concretely to match economic growth needs with social inclusion?
Well, I think the G20 could make a very big step in the right direction if it simply took economic growth, social prosperity, and environmental sustainability equally seriously. So that means not only measuring these things, and as I said, terms of economic measurements, we're fine, and environmental measures, we're making progress, and social measures, we have a way to go, but it all can be done. So if we keep in mind that there are some fundamental needs and purposes that people have, they need solidarity, they need to be embedded within their societies, they need agency, they need to be empowered to steer their destinies through their own efforts. They need to be materially well off, they need material gain, and they need environmental sustainability. If we can keep our eyes balanced across this entire dashboard of needs, then I think we will be in a completely different policymaking world, because then all of a sudden, economic policy, health policy, and social policy will no longer be in conflict with one another. You will see all of them as contributing to human well-being or the satisfaction of human needs and purposes. And for that purpose, I think it will be really important to think about an all-of-government approach. How can health policy, economic policy, social policy work together to achieve this right balance across these different needs and purposes? And one last point, because it has come up repeatedly in this session, is the problem of debt overhang is a very serious one. And no amount of measurement is going to make this go away. And simply getting companies, people to adapt to new circumstances also won't make it go away. So there we need to think of new instruments that will allow financial markets to adapt. And we should take very seriously, in my opinion, earnings-related variable rate bonds and loans, so that when earnings are low for countries or companies, they have a low interest rate. And when those earnings rise, the interest rate rises in tandem. Not too much, but rises so as to avoid the need for bankruptcy. And then another really important instrument would be non-voting contingent convertible bonds, which are bonds that automatically convert into equity once the firm's capital ratios are too low. That would enable the firms to avoid the problem of going bust, because debts would convert into equity. If the government provides support here, then it is really important that these convertible bonds are non-voting bonds, because we don't want the government having a major say in the private sector in the future. But all this can be done. So if we think about helping those in trouble achieve economic success, then we will be successful also in tackling this major problem of debt overhang that we face.
Thank you very much, Professor Snower. I'm conscious of time, so I'll move directly to the questions from the audience. We have quite a few that have been passed on to me. I'll try to address one to each of the speakers. So let's start from Ms. Marcegaglia. What is the role of business, especially micro SMEs, for sustainable and just recovery? And also, what is the effect and role of automation in business?
Okay, so thank you very much. I would say that generally the role of business in sustainable and just growth is key, as I said before, because I think government has to, as it has been said before, has to set up the right policies. The finance is very important, because, as we said before, we need to adapt and to not to have too much money on one part and not money on the other. But I think it's what business has to do in terms of innovation, in terms of investment, in terms of research and technology is key. And the only way to really go towards a carbon neutrality, to have a much more sustainable world, is through the commitment and investment of the company. And also on the other side, if we want more employability, if we want, as Professor Snower said, more attention to inclusion, of course the company cannot do everything by themselves, but we need a strong responsibility also on that. So, and I think, as I said before, in all the different countries, small, medium enterprise are the backbone of the economy, are the one who really are doing a big part of the growth. I think their role is very important. But as I said before, we need not to protect them, but to put them in a condition to really do this job. And so I think their role is very important. And we have also to to boost their capacity to innovate, to create new products and to create new processes. So this is what I think is better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Marcegaglia. Now, a question for Professor Goa. Digital and cyber are controversial issues between China and the West. Where do you see areas for consensus and enhanced digital cooperation in the G20?
Right. I think this is an area is very new and challenging, and in many ways, China had a little bit advanced experience in terms of the platform and technology and practice as well. I think with G20, there are many common ground to work with. The first regulation, I think this is something is quite challenging, because even in China now there are a lot of debates with so whether the government should regulate in a certain degree, so not crush the entrepreneur it's innovation, but at the same time just keep it's like stability and also there are many other new boundaries like privacy problems, and with all those debates could come up with some new ideas. And I think in the area of the regulation, China and especially with EU, they come together to discuss the feasible solutions, how to set up framework, standards, and the practice. This is something I think we should work on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The next question is for Professor Snower. How can the T20 help the G20 to focus on key issues and to encourage them to be courageous, take action, and commit to do, and they've written it in caps, in each country, the necessary measures?
Well, I think the T20 can play an important role because the T20 is not an interest group. It is simply here to help the global public interest have a voice within the G20. And it is also a source of new ideas. And if we're able to present new ideas that are implementable, and if we can also monitor to what degree these new ideas have been taken on and take them from one presidency to the next, so that there's enough time to devote to initiatives that are started under each G20 presidency, then I think we are in a very hopeful situation. So although the presidency of the G20 moves from one country to another, and therefore in each year there is an importance attached to making one's mark on the G20, the T20, along with other and in interaction with other engagement groups, can provide some continuity, in particular in identifying the most potent and implementable ideas and monitoring the degree to which they have been implemented.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question goes to Professor Padoan. It's on the EU's Recovery Fund and the Next Generation EU. The question is, what are the prospects for the EU's Recovery Fund and Next Generation EU to streamline the need for global inclusive growth into the G20's agenda?
Well, this is a unique opportunity. Let me remind ourselves that even before the breakout of the COVID crisis, the new European Commission, headed by Ursula von der Leyen, had put green and sustainable growth and digital transformation at the top of the agenda. So the COVID crisis, in a way, accelerated the agenda implementation. Not only that, the response has been very impressive. Not only, and not so much, actually, I would say, in terms of amount of resources mobilized to drive the new resource, to drive the new growth, but also the way this has been done. What Europe asks of member countries is to accelerate in public investment, accelerate structural reforms, which are key to boosting potential growth. And they're also doing that by issuing new European financial instruments, which are, in my view, the first step towards a fully fledged Eurobond market. So this, from this point of view, the European authorities have taken up the opportunity of dealing with this tremendous health crisis to transform the European economy in a way that is more sustainable. We are not there yet, because national resistance may still be there, and the slowness of some governments to respond to the crisis may be detrimental to the implementation of a response. But the direction is the correct one, and I'm more optimistic about the role that Europe can play in the future. not only on the European geography and European continent, but also globally, also in some cases leading by example by providing new ways to implement sustainable growth in a way that may be useful for other countries as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Padoan, and thank you to all our speakers. My clock says we're past 5 p.m., which means we have reached the end of this session and of today's event. My key takeaway is that while this is not the death of globalization, we must rethink the status quo. We need to make sure our fiscal and economic policies help people and businesses adapt to the so-called new normal. And we also need new metrics beyond economic performance that take into account social inclusion and social cohesion. And the G20 will have a pivotal role in tackling the mismatch our speakers discussed, the reallocation of resources and the problems linked to an uneven recovery. As a final remark, let me remind you that the closing session of the T20 Inception Conference will be held tomorrow, Tuesday, February 9th at 3 p.m. Central European Time. Thank you to our hosts, Ispi, the National Coordinator and the Chair of the Think 20 Italy, and a big, big thank you to the whole team behind today's event. And from me, Silvia Sciorilli Borrelli, goodbye for now.